Well, first of all, if we look at who has signed and ratified this agreement, we find we have Bush, who is probably at 30%. We have Harper, who is leading a minority government and has no more than 33%. And we have Calderon, whose election is still under dispute. So we have three rogues negotiating the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And all three countries, if you examine international agreements, and this is something I've been working on for years. I wrote a book on what governments had agreed to, and I go often to international conferences and try to embarrass them, because I say, in 1972 you agreed to this, in 1982 you agreed to this, in 95 you did this. And most countries have complied with international law, but here the countries that are involved with the S.P.P. are three rogue states, particularly the U.S. The U.S. rarely signs and ratifies international agreements. Canada signs and ratifies almost everything but implements nothing. And Mexico does more or less the same. And what I wanted to do was to refer to a very important convention. It's the Convention in the Law of Treaties. And under this convention, Article 53, it says that a treaty or an agreement should be null and void if it is in violation of peremptory norms. And peremptory norms are norms that are agreed to, either unanimously adopted in the international forums by all states, or that it is agreed to by most states representing reflecting different legal systems and reflecting different geographical areas. So what I did was go through the S.P.P. document. I don't have it with me. I didn't have a chance to bring it, to compare what they've agreed to there and what has been agreed to internationally. And for example, I'll go through some instances. For example, the three countries, in fact, have signed and ratified the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And you must all remember what happened to Medea Benjamin. Are you all familiar with what happened to her when she came to the border? She was not allowed to go into Canada. She is the director of Code Pink. And Code Pink was one of the principal organizations that opposed the invasion of Iraq. And she was not allowed to come in. And the border guards in Canada referred to an FBI list. And in that way, her civil and political rights have been violated. So here is an example of an agreement that actually has been signed and ratified, but not implemented by the three countries. With the obsession with security, more and more of the civil and political rights are being ignored. And in both Canada and the U.S., we have the Patriot Act in the U.S., which definitely violates civil and political rights. And we have in Canada the Anti-Terrorism Act, which certainly violates civil and political rights. If we look at labor conventions, there are about 180 different international labor organization conventions. I believe the U.S. has ratified 6. Canada has ratified about 8, and Mexico has ratified, I think, about 30. And even if they ratify, they haven't been implementing them. So again, you know, here are 3 states that are in complete defiance of international law. If we look at environmental law, the S.P.P. is calling for harmonization of standards, a smooth, seamless transition among different standards. And if we look at what has been agreed to internationally, in the areas of climate change, for example, a lot of people don't know that the U.S. actually signed and ratified the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Most of the time, you hear people talk about the protocol, the Kyoto Protocol. The U.S. is bound to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and has been essentially allowing the corporate deniers of climate change to contribute to complete non-compliance with the convention. Canada is the same. They have done absolutely nothing in relation to climate change. And under the Climate Change Convention is a very important principle. It's called the precautionary principle. Where there is a threat to the environment, the lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent the threat. All 3 countries have been in violation of this principle. Also, at the Habitat 2 conference in 1996, every member state of the United Nations agreed to ensure that corporations comply with international law, including international environmental law. And what we've been finding over the years, that there has been complete disregard for international environmental law. We also have something that came in the Habitat 2 document. Every country in the world agreed to it, and that was to reduce the ecological footprint. And what we have found is that over the years, certainly since 1996, the ecological footprint has been considerably increased. If we look at human rights legislation, we find that 2 of the 3 countries are such rogue states that there were 4 countries that refused to adopt the International Convention for the Protection of Indigenous Rights. There were 4 countries, and there was an election in Australia, and the Australian government decided to adopt it. So Canada and the US have not been willing to adopt this international declaration. If we look at migrant workers, there's a very important convention called the Convention for the Protection of Migrant Workers and Their Families. Well, Canada and the US have refused to ratify it. If we look at the rights of the child, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the US is one of the few countries that has refused to ratify the rights of the child. Extremely important document, and they have refused. If we look at the Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, the US has refused to sign and ratify that, and they also have refused to sign and ratify the very important protocol to prevent violence against women. The US particularly is definitely a rogue state. And when I confronted the head of a delegation at the United Nations, the head of the US delegation, and referred to the US as a rogue state, he went over to the Canadian delegation and asked them if they would remove me from the UN. And of course, the Canadian government was only too happy to do this, but they're not allowed to do it. Also, there's a very important covenant, the Social, Economic, and Cultural Covenant. And that is a covenant that ensures the right to food, the right to housing. At the conference, Habitat 2 conference, the US refused to support the right to housing because they have not signed and ratified the International Covenant of Social and Economic and Cultural Rights. Canada has signed and ratified it, but has not included it in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it is not really implemented into statutory laws in Canada. And if we look at agreements related to peace, well, right now, the 2 countries, particularly Canada and the US, have really increased the military budget, and there's been pressure on Mexico to increase the military budget and, in fact, change the constitution in Mexico to allow a private intrusion into homes where they suspect that there might be a violation of international law. It's the same sort of thing, a violation of certain laws within Mexico. So there's a law, and this is as a result of S.P.P. In Mexico, when I was there were 2 major issues. One was with NAFTA, but it's also carried over into the S.P.P. The border in Mexico was opened as of January 1st, 2008, to genetically engineered corn from the US and from Canada. And corn is such a staple in Mexico. And when I was there were slogans saying, "Sin maíz, no hay país." You know, there's without corn, we have no country. And there was an incredible rally. You know, Rob was saying earlier that rallies don't work. Well, I don't think he's seen a rally in Mexico. 150 to 200,000 people walking for 5 kilometers, tractors from all over the country, Zapatista riding in horseback. They set up a stable in front of the legislature with the cows because they also as of the 1st of January, milk from the US and Canada was allowed into Mexico. And as you know, in the U.S., bovine growth hormone is used in milk. Now, this is banned in Canada and probably banned in the U.S. So this rally was to oppose genetically engineered corn coming from Canada and the U.S. and milk with bovine growth hormone coming from the U.S. Also, one of the main issues in the SPP is to have a reliable source of energy, i.e. energy to satisfy generally U.S. wants, and there's a major push in Canada to develop the oil sands. And even though there's going to be environmental degradation, and they're even talking about using nuclear energy to develop the oil sands. In Mexico, it's a major, major issue, the privatization of Pemex. And the Mexicans had another big rally, not quite with 100,000 people, but it was saying the same thing. Without Pemex, we have no country. So they're very, very strong in it. I think if the SPP is going to be declared null and void, it will come through Mexico because there's so much animosity towards it. And the party that almost was in power, the PRD, the Socialist Party, is very active in this campaign. And they hold not the balance of power. Of course, the PAN party, the right-wing party, holds a balance of power, but they are very, very powerful. And when I was there, they were talking about organizing a campaign right across the country with people nominated in every city, every province in Mexico to organize a campaign against the privatization of Pemex. So that's a major, major campaign there. And there's also lawyers speaking out all over Mexico against the change in the Constitution. There were two changes that were extremely important, and they were relaxing standards and allowing more intervention, state intervention. But I just want to make the point that what we should be talking about, I think, is that the Security and Prosperity Partnership should be declared null and void because it violates international norms. And it's important to know what governments have agreed to and for you to lobby your government. I mentioned in the little write-up that I had written a book on what governments have agreed to. And it's amazing what they agreed to. The rhetoric is absolutely incredible. But if we don't use the documents, the governments don't care. If we're not there to stand up and say, well, at such and such a time, you agreed. For example, they agreed over the years to reallocate the military budget. You've all heard of the peace dividend. Do we ever hear about this now? This was always, they would talk about the waste and misuse of resources in the military and to reallocate the peace dividend and provide for the developed countries. And one last thing is that I know, I'll just say this briefly, but I know that a lot of people in the 9/11 movement talk against the UN. Now, I would agree. I think the UN Security Council, for me, is nothing more than an affirmative action program for nuclear powers. What do they all have in common? The 5 major powers. And what they always do is cajole and intimidate and bribe. And I was at the UN when just before they went into Iraq, and I could see what was happening. In fact, I went up the elevator one time, and I heard people say that the US is leaning on Guinea. But the General Assembly should not be criticized because that represents the sovereign equality of states. And even Castro and Chavez really supports the General Assembly because that's where you can get a majority vote, including setting up an international tribunal under Article 22 of the Charter to try Bush, Cheney, and their whole group for crimes against humanity. And when I was at the UN, this was a year or so ago, I was lobbying state delegations, and I lobbied at least 70 delegations, and they all said that was exactly what has to be done. But they are so intimidated by the US. And I don't know if you remember what happened in 1991 when Yemen voted against the invasion of Iraq in 1991. And the US said that is the most expensive decision that you've ever made. Yeah. And that's what the countries fear.
They cut off funding.
They cut off complete funding. So I think we both have, and our government is moving more and more towards the U.S. And because of the flawed electoral system, we have the first past the post system. The opposition parties, even though they are against and represent two-thirds majority in Parliament, they will not bring down the government, and because they're afraid that there will be a splitting of the vote, because the three parties will be drawing upon more or less the same range of constituents. But we really are in a constitutional crisis in Canada, because under our Constitution, in order for international law to be binding, it only has to be agreed to by the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And so that's why we have Canada going all over the world now, speaking on behalf of Canada. And Bush has no right to speak on behalf of the U.S. with 30%. Calderon has no right to speak on behalf of Mexico when an election is still under dispute. And certainly Harper has no right to speak for Canada. And so I hope that might give you yet one more strategy to try to counteract the S.P.P. Thank you.